Hello, everyone. 14th of April, and today I have a very special guest, Professor Joshua Vermilion from University of Nebraska. I'm very glad that he accepted my offer, and he's here to lecture about his very special architectural spaces and how actually he diffuse them into new forms using artificial intelligence. Welcome, Professor Joshua Vermilion. I'm very glad that you're here. And can I ask you to briefly talk about yourself?
Absolutely. Thank you, fellow professor, for inviting me this morning. It's morning here. I know it's evening in Ankara. Thank you again for inviting me, and I appreciate everybody who's going to spend a little bit of their Friday with me. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm an architectural technologist, and so I've always been interested in how digital technologies are absorbed into the design process, how they either evolve or disrupt the design process, how we design things, how we make things, how we produce things, how they're assembled at the end. I've been doing this for a long time, and we'll show some examples here in a bit that sort of show this breadth. But you know, I think there's a really interesting time that we have here now, and that we're suddenly confronting face-to-face with artificial intelligence, which is one of these terms that we've heard a lot about over the longest time, actually, but it's been sort of abstract and off in the distance. It sort of promised more than it could possibly do, and then suddenly it's here. So, but I'm actually done a lot with parametric design, computational design, generative design, using computers in ways that we can't design with a pencil or pen, which is what I actually learned. Like those traditional tools is how I learned how to design. And then also using non-traditional or CNC digital tools to produce and manipulate materials. So digital fabrication, 3D printing, and the like. And so I hope this morning, while I'm going to first start with my work in artificial intelligence, to then at the end sort of wrap all three of these aspects together, generative design, artificial intelligence, digital fabrication together, to talk about a possible new trajectory. And hopefully that's provocative enough that you'll have lots of questions or comments, and we can have a discussion afterwards.
Thank you. Joshua, the screen is yours.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen okay now?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I start with a quote from Stuart Russell from University of California, Berkeley. This is essentially the old story of the genie in the lamp, or the sorcerer's apprentice, or King Midas. You get exactly what you ask for and not what you want. Russell's quote above was in response to the potential existential threats posed by AI systems. And indeed, as artificial intelligence becomes more ubiquitous in our daily lives, it could very well take over the world. But first, and as anybody who's recently used some of these text-to-image language models can attest to, AI seems really hell-bent on just generating really lovely images in provocative spaces. And for the pioneers using AI to generate these visuals, the second part of Russell's statement rings true. Getting what you asked for and getting what you wanted aren't necessarily one and the same. Text-to-image diffusion models might seem like they're everywhere right now, but for the longest time, AI was talked about in the abstract as something that would be powerful for sure, but off in the future. And as AI has gradually been integrated into our society, it was largely for a long time underneath the hood, so to say, sort of there, present, but invisible, out of sight and out of mind. It might help the bank sort of recognize a deposit that you didn't make, or it might help Instagram better curate your social media feed or something like that. But it wasn't something that we interacted with on a daily basis as consumers. This distance between an all-powerful but abstract neural network and our everyday realities made this summer's explosion of all of these consumer-ready artificial intelligence apps all the more sudden and intriguing. And it really did seem to explode this past summer. All of these things were then suddenly available to us and at our fingertips. As we've gotten a taste of the generative powers of these systems, we now have the responsibility to ask more critical questions about the design process and how these tools will disrupt or hopefully augment our ability to design. But first, let's talk about words, and particularly how these systems use our words to give us the outputs that we didn't even want, and how this is actually a feature and not a bug. This is something that we actually want. Here's the famous saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And in fact, these diffusion models generate images directly from our words, called prompts. How does one write a prompt? We describe what we want to see in plain language. Some write long, elaborate prompts, describing a rich and vibrant tableau with the greatest attention to detail. Maybe the broad strokes, but along with the details, the minutiae. The setting, the context, the mood, the materials, textures, and other details are cast in vivid language. So you can see here, these are examples of some of my work using artificial intelligence. And then it basically takes our words and it positions them within a sort of latent space of how it learned, and then denoises a random seed of static into a lovely set of images. Others prefer an economy of words, short prompts that quickly point the AI in the direction of subject matter, and then rely on its imagination, and I say imagination in quotes, to fill in the gaps. The kind of architectural ad-libbing that many of us do with a pen and sketchbook to generate intentional and purposeful ambiguity at the earliest stages of our idea explorations. One thing is certain, it seems almost humorous, if not cruel, that for so long, architects took such painstaking labor to draw and redraw things over and over again by hand, and then to draw and redraw things over and over again with a mouse cursor on the screen. And then even later, to write scripts and programming languages, computer coding, and many of us still do all of the above. What happens when we can just tell the computer or a smartphone even what we want in plain language, and it generates images of it for us? This abrupt change in human-machine interaction, when we can simply tell the computer what we want, rather than manually drawing or modeling with a mouse and keyboard, is a real change. It's a real sea change in how we might work. Or at least it will, I think, once these models get much more complex, once they're capable of generating outputs with formal and spatial logics, and that can respond to programmatic and environmental and material and cultural constraints. The one immediate change that I and many others have noticed while using these language models is more fundamental and not necessarily dependent on all these real-world constraints like culture and material and environment. The immediate value in these text-to-image models is our shift away from using computational tools to quickly execute our explicit, detailed instructions, but instead to embrace the computer's generative capacity to interpret our instructions and surprise us with its oracle-like wisdom. And I use oracle again in quotes. To those who use these language models for the first time, the effect that it possesses some sort of precognition calculated from the sum total of its training data seems nothing short of magic. It appears as an oracle with very quick answers generated at ruthless speeds to any design challenge that can be expressed with words. But over time, the seeming wisdom evolves into more of a naivety. As one continues to use these models, you can begin to see and then brush up against the current limitations of these tools. And indeed, these diffusion models often combine things in weird or naive or even frankly idiotic ways. In fact, this is my favorite image. This is an architectural building section. And it looks, as you just at sort of quickly, it looks like this sort of really interesting section. We have, stacked floor plates. We have a sort of atrium in the center to bring some multi-story volumetric variety into the space. And then it treated down here, it treated the trees, the vegetation as poche, and then cut through it, and then that decided to insert program inside. A completely idiotic thing to do, and yet brilliant in its own way, right? It made me rethink section entirely. So they often combine things in idiotic ways, and rather than an oracle, perhaps a better comparison is one of a savant that is frighteningly good at drawing materials and effects and atmospherics, even though the model has no idea what materials, effects, or atmospherics even are. Aside from their knack for generating visual effects with stunning speed, these diffusion models differ from the rest of our digital design toolset in another important way. While parametric design and building information modeling seem like an exercise that help us resolve ambiguity in the design process with precision, these diffusion models work completely differently. They're not about giving us precision. They're not about helping us resolve ambiguity. I would liken them to the devil's advocate. The outputs don't necessarily give us answers, but rather they generate ambiguity and imprecision that challenge and then sharpen our ideas, positions, and questions. The diffusion model doesn't think like we do, and that's exactly the point. Within this frame, using AI diffusion models for developing your ideas is akin to rolling the dice to discover, by chance, new and unintentional combinations of spatial and material effects, rather than working from the preconceived or a priori intentions. And given this sensibility, it shouldn't come as a surprise that some of us are actively deploying these systems to seek out surprising and unpredictable results from our initial ideas. Seeking the counterintuitive or the uncanny is a way to augment the imagination and the process of critically interrogating and exhausting scenarios and strategies based on our initial seeds of ideas. While constantly searching for happy accidents might not seem like the most optimal way to use one's time, the speedy affordances of these tools allow for anyone to be incredibly prolific in generating hundreds of options within a very short amount of time. And this speed, along with the model's skill at generating captivating visuals of forms, textures, lightings, and atmospherics, seem to be a pervasive value proposition for users. In fact, where I teach for the first time ever, my students actually iterate their writings about their design intents and desires, which is something very hard to get my undergraduate architecture students to have done in the past. They're now searching for combinations of very expressive words to describe the ideas that are in their heads and to communicate them to the diffusion model. It's like a new language of architecture, one that we have to use to communicate to the machine. Like Pavlov's dog, they are rewarded for their task of writing and rewriting roughly 90 seconds later by the AI with a lovely set of visuals. And the beauty of images no longer leaves our students speechless and satisfied, but rather they spend time curating the next batch of words, verbs, adjectives, and modifiers to test out this new iterative design skill of prompt writing. It's still really too early to know just how and in what ways these technologies will evolve, much less to the extent that they will disrupt the professional and creative discipline of architecture. But I will say and point out the sort of uncanny resemblance that these models have to something that Nicholas Negroponte pointed out 50 years ago, 1970. The founder of the MIT Media Lab wrote a book called The Architectural Machine. And Negroponte foretold prophetically of a future in which the design process, considered as evolutionary, can be presented to a machine also considered as evolutionary, and a mutual training, resilience, and growth can be developed. In talking about how architects can begin to have a design dialogue with the computer in a much more fruitful way, one that doesn't just replace or try to replicate what we can do with our analog tools, but one that is inherently digital and perhaps even cybernetic, right? For over 50 years, this architectural machine remained a distant promise, right up until the summer of 2022, when suddenly anyone and everyone seemed to be able to wield an image-generating architectural machine through apps on their smartphone. Now the genie is out of the bottle and the world is very suddenly and very quickly changing. Negroponte wrote, "The design process considered as evolutionary can be presented to machine." I just talked about that quote. He further elaborated, "Treat this problem as the design problem, as the intimate association of two dissimilar species, man and machine. Two dissimilar processes, design and computation, and two intelligent systems, the architect and the architecture machine. By virtue of ascribing intelligence to an artifact or the artificial, the partnership is not one of master and slave, but rather of two associates that have a potential desire for self-improvement." Again.
Joshua, excuse me. Can
Sure.
I quickly translate after you finish?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, please.
Okay. So I understand you give a break. Okay. Şimdi şu ana kadar aslında bahsettiği konu generatif modelleme, özellikle mekanın içinde bugün çok sıklıkla kullanılan mekan tasarımlarında kişinin hayal gücünü üst katmanlara çıkaran yeni bir bakış açısı, özellikle yüzeye ve renk vermeye. 1970'lerde Nicolas Negroponte'nin aslında şu anda yaşanacak olan ya da yaşanılan duruma bir açılım getirdiği kitabından bahsediyor. Özellikle de mimari alanın çözümlenmesiyle ilgili, insanın kendisini daha iyi hissedeceği bir alana doğru diye ifade edilen ve Joshua Vermilion'un da kendi aslında dijital tasarım yapan kişilere, özellikle öğrencilere açılımlarını dile getirdiği bir kitabı var. Ve bu iç mekan tasarımlarında aslında yapay zeka ile oluşturulan alanın insan algısını farklı şekilde çeşitlediğini, daha şiirsel bir mekan yarattığını ve iki tane aslında ileri görüşü bir araya getirdiğini, hem şöyle mimarın kendi düşündüğü, kendi ifade etmeye çalıştığı şey, bir de makinenin aslında ortaya koyduğu şeyin bir araya gelmesi ve yeni bir ürün yaratması. Ve bu ürün aslında baktığımız zaman bize yapay bir ürün gibi geliyor. Ama burada artık biz yani bir master, üreten kişi ve üretilen nesne olarak bakmıyoruz bu duruma. Bunlar her ikisi de bir potansiyel üreten ve birbirlerini destekleyen bir bütün olarak yansıyorlar.
Thank you. There's more text here, so sorry about that. But I'll just say again, I'll just skip this slide. I think what's more important is this one. An architect-machine symbiosis is the sort of conclusion here. Right? This idea, symbiosis of what architects or the humans can do and what machines are capable of doing, as a sort of forming a partnership, which is a new way of thinking about tools, I think. Right?
Bu simbiyosis aslında mimarla makinenin yeni bir şey üretmek üzere yeni bir forma dönüşmesi gibi düşünülebilir. Bu yeni üretmek için artık eşit platformlarda üretene doğru giden yeni bir faz.
Thank you. But what about the idea of prompt craft? The idea of craft, I think, is an interesting one. Is it craft if anyone can do it? And does skill development in prompt writing require careful practice? For that matter, does it require talent? I would argue yes to all three of these. At the end of the day, the human carries the creative burden of the process in imagining ideas, articulating them through the creative medium of writing, which requires skill and creativity. And then also providing direction, selection, and curation, which largely rests on critical thinking, iteration, and taste. It certainly seems to meet the criteria that Malcolm McCullough stated in his book, Abstracting Craft, which I consider a seminal text in sort of weaving together craft with digital tools and media. Deploying AI tools does require giving up some control while shaping media in less direct ways. And I think this is an important point as well. I'm reminded of when I first started writing scripts, and I'll just sort of show some of these design scripts that I work on now. When I was designing, I would start first encountering this idea of writing my own scripts and letting the computer help generate some of these things. I'd write a script and execute it, watching the machine rapidly perform some of these tasks that I would find too tedious or difficult or time-consuming to help speed things up, to augment my workflow. Even when giving up direct control, there was something satisfying back then about making the machines work for me. And that feeling comes back today while experimenting with artificial intelligence-driven design tools. ChatGPT, or in fact, in coming full circle, I've been experimenting with ChatGPT to write design scripts for me, and it has already shown to be an able partner. 1/3 of the time, it gives me a result that's perfect. It's exactly what I asked for. Another 1/3 of the time, it just doesn't simply work. It just gives me something that is fundamentally flawed in the syntax and just doesn't work. And the last 1/3 of the time, it gives me something that I didn't ask for, but is at least as interesting, if not more interesting than what I was asking for. So by relinquishing control, I give the tools and media the space to generate results that I may never have dreamed of, essentially combining my intellect and imagination through words with the expansive latent design space of the language model that the artificial intelligence uses.
Yapay zekaya aslında bazı komutlar verdiğimde benim düşüncemin ötesinde en sonda gördüğünüz bu açık tonda olan renklendirilen çok uçuk pembe olan figür benim hayalimin dışında da bazı şeyleri üretmesini sağladı. İlk etapta yaptığımda böyle çok anlamsız çizgilerden oluşan bir ekran, ama bunun belki de en güzel tarafı bir makinaya benim ne istediğimi anlatabilmem ve sonuçta bana limitsiz, beklemediğim tasarım formlarını vermesi.
Thank you. As we continue to interrogate these new tools to discover their abilities, we must always ask how they might help us reshape and redefine the ways in which we work. I've found this to be a self-reflection opportunity for those of us in the profession or discipline of architecture to better understand how we design, and how these tools will augment or evolve the design process. Already, a diffusion model feels like having our very own creative team at our own fingertips, ready to brainstorm any idea that we can write down, from the normative to the outlandish, like this one. And just like...
Bu formda gördüğünüz gibi aslında generatif modellemeden normal mimari tasarım yaptığımız şekliyle değil de bu şekle dönüşmesini sağlayabilmek beni mutlu eden konulardan bir tanesi diyor.
And just like having a talented creative team, we must now prepare to be surprised at the results every time we roll the dice with a prompt using artificial intelligence. the varied interpretations, the surprise juxtapositions, oftentimes the most interesting results are those that subvert our preconceptions, forcing us to look at our own ideas in very different ways, and therefore extending our imaginations. And with language as our mediator between us and our machines, I think it now leads us to sort of get down to the very serious task of studying this sort of new language of architecture. The images are very provocative, they're very cool. But aren't the words and the ideas that they imbue just as valuable? If we examine our means of communication with these new tools, we can call it prompt craft if we want, but I think we come to what I think is a very fundamentally human prompt. And it reveals our values and ethos as a profession and as a discipline. And that is, now that we get what we ask for, what are we going to ask?
Şimdi bu aslında limitsiz kendi düşüncemizin bir yansıması olan bu yeni modellemeler aslında anında belki değişim yaratan ama o anda bizim düşündüğümüz şeyin modellemeye dönüşmesi gibi düşünülebilir. O nedenle de bizim bakış açımızı da bir anlamda özetliyor. Yani yapay zeka ile üretilmiş olsa da.
Thank you. So I've done a lot of work with digital technologies that span both the theoretical as well as the physical. And so the things that I explore with artificial intelligence definitely have a derivative lineage from past work that I've actually designed, constructed, and installed. I can't go through everything right now, but I thought I would touch on a few examples of some of the installation work that I've done in the past that deal with digital fabrication and also with trying to embed sensing and robotics into the built environment.
Benim geçmişte yaptığım çalışmalarımı hem teori hem pratik aslında hepsini bir araya getiriyor ve bunlara dijital bir doku oluşturuyor yapay zeka. Bu da beni çok etkiliyor.
Right, so I do these a lot with students. You'll see all my collaborators listed at the beginning of each one. I always find it very important to give everybody as much credit as possible because these things are always team-based. They're never singular efforts. And in fact, sometimes when it comes to getting architecture students or folks who aren't used to dealing with the technical side of robotics, we rely on these Lego robotics kits and other sorts of packaged kits that come with this sort of kit of parts and have a usable interface so we can begin to get down to the business of prototyping. And then quickly we start to customize the kit of parts with our own parts using laser cutting and other technologies to help us start to shape and extend the parts and the sort of languages that we use to generate form and spatial effects. This is an example of one in which we populated a glass wall very quickly. This was over 2 days, starting out initially with students. Their idea was to modulate sunlight through the glass robotically. And so they began to create this system of gears and drive belts and stepper motors in order to accomplish this. You can see that in order to touch the glass, they developed a system of suction cupped, which is a really interesting detail and not necessarily one you would think of as an architectural detail. And I'll just let the video explain best. Right, so somebody trips the sensor by walking by and then suddenly this installation that was actually deployed in the building starts to dance around. In this case, it's much more meant to be a spectacle, but it could actually be based on performance. Maybe there's beginning to talk about program on one side and sunlight on the other side.
Bu twist adını verdiği öğrencileriyle birlikte yaptığı çalışma çok ilginç. Legolardan yola çıktıktan sonra bunlardan modelleme üretip bunları aslında döküp daha sonra da bir enstalasyon haline getirip kişi hareketine duyarlı şekilde değişim gösteren bir enstalasyon üretiyorlar birlikte öğrencileriyle. Mekanda aslında kişiye özel hareket yaratan bir çeşitlilik. Okay.
And I do want to make sure we have time for discussion, so I'm just going to fly through a couple more examples, and I'll wrap up so we can maybe have a less formal discussion. Here's another example, and this is very similar to some of the things I study with artificial intelligence, where I use lots and lots and lots of small parts, very simple parts actually, but when you repeat them over and over again, it creates a larger, more complex system. In this case, it's hanging from a ceiling. This is a project we did with in collaboration with Philip Beasley out of the University of Toronto. He does these magnificent installation pieces, and you can see they're sort of multi-layered, they're immersive. Here's a diagram sort of showing how that works. But basically we use these A-frames as levers. Over here on the right, I don't know if you can see my cursor. We have custom air muscles that begin to scissor the A-frames, which then begin to shake and create pulse responses throughout the installation based on folks walking through it and setting off infrared sensors. All right, here is some of our examples of us assembling it, putting it together. And then I have another video that I can show here in just a second. We're reinstalling it in a different public space. You can sort of see how it works a little better. And in this case, it's still fundamentally, I think, an architectural problem in that, you know, we have a sort of modularity, repetition, parts of the whole. These are the infrared sensors. And you can see those custom air muscles contracting in order to create this sort of pulsing shape responses throughout the system. I'll just turn down the volume if you'd like to translate.
Bu da Arcus Animus diye bahsettiği University of Toronto'dan bir kolaboratörle çalıştığı bir proje. Aslında bunda da bir alan yaratıyorlar. Farklı tabakalarla ve bu alanın içerisinde çok sensörlü enstalasyonlarla kişi içinden geçtiği zaman değişen bir enstalasyon yaratıyorlar mimari alanın içerisinde.
Thank you. One more. This is another example where we try to create a moving false ceiling inside a fitting room for a boutique fashion store. The idea is that the ceiling moves and responds to human occupation inside the fitting room. And of course, we were trying to figure out the mechanics and electronics, lots of prototyping. In this case, lots of trial and error, unfortunately. But we were able to put this together. And again, this is the sort of first dry fit, sort of putting it together, disassembling it, reassembling it. Lots of prototyping involved, lots of tests before finally deploying it in a show in Florence, Italy. And I'll let this video go if you'd like to. Maybe there's another opportunity to translate before we move to maybe a discussion or questions.
Bu çalışmada moda, özellikle moda çekimlerinde kullanılmak üzere yapılmış bir enstalasyonu gösteriyor. Sürekli hareket eden ve ışığı da ona göre yansıtan bir enstalasyon sistemi.
Right. And here it is actually installed in Florence. The really lovely installation.
Bu iş Floransa'da şu anda.
So I wanted to maybe wrap up the slides so that we could have maybe a more back and forth discussion. Or if anybody has any questions, I'm certainly open to this. And
okay, I will let
your
this
feedback.
Ask questions to you. Any questions from the guests?
İllur Hocam.
Evet, buyurun.
Mühür Hocam, önce kendisine teşekkür, ben Rengin Erdal. Önce kendisine bir teşekkür edin bu bilimsel ziyafet için ve şu yorumumu iletir misiniz? Eğer
Tabii.
Zaha Hadid yaşasaydı bütün binalarının içini bu enstalasyonlarla donatırdı.
Tamam, hemen kendisine soruyorum.
Evet.
First of all, Rengin Erdal, I would like to thank you very much for your talk. And she's asking if Zaha Hadid was alive today, how would she transfer her architectural spaces using artificial intelligence?
Thank you.
Fascinating question. I can't speak for Hadid herself, but I would point out that her office is still going strong, and they are on the vanguard, one of the firms in the vanguard of interrogating these systems and using them. Both, I'm not exactly quite sure exactly how at which parts they're actually using these systems, but they're actively using them. In fact, some of the folks I know best that are known for using these diffusion models are actually working in Zaha Hadid's office in London. So I believe that Patrick Schumacher has spoken about this with Neil Leach a few times. If you're interested in hearing more about what their office is thinking when it comes to artificial intelligence. I believe last weekend, if you go to Digital Futures World's YouTube channel, you can find that he was part of a panel. Patrick Schumacher, Zaha's old partner, and who's now leading the firm forward. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet. It's been very busy, actually. But I'm looking forward to sort of better understanding where these things are going. Another firm that comes to mind is Wolf Kricks's Co-op Immobilier, who's been using artificial intelligence or studying artificial intelligence for a while. And my colleague who teaches at Florida Atlantic University, Daniel Bolajan, before he started teaching in the United States, he was working at Co-op Immobilier researching these things. How could artificial intelligence be used in the design process? And it's really quite interesting. It goes way beyond these diffusion models, but it's in a limited way. I would liken the technology to something in its very infancy. It's a baby. And it's a fast-growing infant, but it's still, we're just barely scraping the surface, so to say, so far as to what it can do. And I don't know if it needs to be translated back. If so, I'll sort of pause there.
Rengin Hocam,
Evet.
Zahid'in ölümünden sonra onun geleneğini devam eden partneri Patrick Schumacher, firmanın sahibi olan kişinin aslında benzer çalışmaları yürüttüğünden ve bunun dışında birkaç tane mimari firmadan ve mimarlardan da söz etti. Aslında Zahid zaten kendi başına, yani mimariyi oluşturduğu zaman inanılmaz bir geometri ve o geometrinin içerisinde de her bir yapının kendi kimliğini oluşturan faktörleri o yapının özelliğiyle ortaya zaten koyuyordu. O nedenle aslında biz ona zaten postmodernist mimaride ana unsurlardan bir tanesi ve bizi hani çok sıra dışı düşünmeye iten bir mimar olarak biliyoruz ve çok adı geçiyor aslında. Benim burada ekleyeceğim bir şey var. Serra Utku Mikiz'in yazıları var PA'de. PA diye bir sayfa var. Oraya bakarsanız orada aslında bu alanda yapılan çalışmalar çok güzel bir şekilde dünya platformunda ve Joshua'nın işlerinde yorumlarıyla var. Şimdi başka soru var mı?
May I ask a question to
Evet.
Joshua? I'm
Çok
Emel
teşekkür-
Caktürk.
Çok teşekkür.
Buyurun, buyurun.
Okay,
Sorunuz?
Joshua, thank you for this inspiring presentation. Firstly, you said about something prompt crafting, and it was really interesting. I think you said that if it's a craft, it suggests that anyone can do it, right? But also it's called sometimes prompt design or prompt engineering, you know, that's suggesting it belongs to a field of design or engineering. So I'm curious, which one is close to your approach? Which one do you prefer, prompt crafting, prompt design, or prompt engineering?
That's a fantastic question. And I'm not sure I have a satisfying answer to that yet. But what I will say is that I think, to me, there are different sorts of users of artificial intelligence. And so I can come at it from my view. What I'd like to do, or what I'm trying to do, is really think about artificial intelligence as something that could be explored, almost interrogated, to try to better understand it as a creative medium, or something that can generate creative medium. And so to me, that begins to suggest there's a feedback loop between what we do and what it produces.
Evet.
And to me, I think maybe the word craft then better situates the way I see it as something that requires practice, that we could begin to pick up on patterns, and that there is some sort of skill involved with getting either certain results that we would like to see, or teasing out results that we would never have even imagined, and letting the AI sort of tease our imaginations. And I think that's another thing too. The sticking point here is that, you know, for instance, right now, I think it's fair to say I didn't sign a non-disclosure agreement. So I'm working with both Pirelli, the Italian company, and then also hopefully with Harper's Bazaar in Europe on some things. And one of the things that a lot of folks who haven't used artificial intelligence have a hard time wrapping their heads around, a hard time understanding, is just how much control you give up in working with these tools. So you're only suggesting things, and then it gives you stuff. And it's almost like you're mining for what it can give you. It's like you're discovering. Idea finding rather than idea just rather than just idea representing. So giving up control to a certain degree is also, I think, a part of this. And so I think when you give up control, then it's incumbent on you to, again, think about what constitutes a good output. And I think that's fundamentally a human craft or design-based question. And it's also maybe an ethical question as well, depending on what you're trying to do and all these other sort of aspects. So I don't know, I'm kind of reticent to sort of add engineering or architecting to at the end of another word. You know, like programmers sometimes call themselves sort of, you know, software engineers or software architects. And I kind of cringe at that sort of description. But I do think that there's a space for folks who are really trying to deploy these systems in ways that aren't, I guess, asking themselves, how are these systems different than, let's say, any of the other tools that we have at our disposal, right? And I think that's always the question when it comes to these new tools. We shape the tools, but then how are they shaping us back? How are they evolving what we do, or augmenting the things that we do, or changing how we think about the world and how we then design for the world and for humans? And so I think that's, you know, in I would call that maybe a prompt craft or prompt writing. I would stop short of calling it prompt engineering, because I think prompt engineering also, maybe in my mind, implies that there's a sort of formulaic way of writing these prompts. And from my own personal experiments and experience, that's not necessarily the case. I'm still always surprised by the results. And sometimes I can write very long, detailed prompts and get things out. Sometimes I can write very short prompts. I don't think there's one way to do it, but I think engineering implies that there's a problem and a solution. And I think that this is, as a creative medium, if we think about it as a creative medium, is maybe not one fundamentally of engineering, although it is, of course, based largely on computer science, in order to sort of train these things and weight these models to make them useful for us. So it's not a very satisfactory, maybe not a satisfying answer, in that I'm sort of addressing your question, but I don't know if there's really an answer. But I certainly hope that I've addressed it based on my experience and where my thinking is at presently.
Thank you.
But fundamentally, the words matter, right? Like now I find myself being very precise with the words I use, because I have to be to the AI. And so now, so, you know, is it architecting or engineering or designing or craft or writing, right? It's something that now sort of comes to, like, my mind is constantly thinking about these things. So I find that question very fascinating, because it's been on my mind. It weighs on me when I sort of think about how to sort of, it's so new and things are moving so quickly that, you know, it's moving quicker than any kind of body of any recent body of theory or knowledge can really sort of be described and written down. So you see folks talking about, we sort of looking at the future through the rearview mirror, where like I mentioned, Nicholas Negroponte is writing from 1970. You know, it's sort of, you know, there's not a lot of new writing about these things because they're so new, they're so novel. And things are moving so quickly that even the things that are written seem out of date within a week or two. So.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Very interesting one.
Mm-hmm. And Joshua already talked about actually symbiosis of architect and the machine, and prompt human craft through this achievement. It's like an evolution. In a way, you have no control over it once you start it, as you have summarized it. Başka soru var mı? Soru ya da yorum getirmek isteyen? Then I will ask you a question
Sure.
about the tools that you are using actually. When I enter architectural, sites, especially dealing with what you are doing, there are certain programs like Grasshopper for beginners, Revit for beginners, Houdini, data-driven morphic systems. Which program do you use actually to convert your ideas into artificial intelligence generated images?
Right. So when it comes to using the AI tool, my tool of choice is called Midjourney. So if you go to midjourney.com, you can sign up for an account. But basically, Midjourney is one of these diffusion models, a large language model. You basically can chat with the Midjourney robot through direct messaging on Discord app. So Discord is one of those apps that are free that lets you sort of, communicate between people and communities. And so, that's what I use. I use Midjourney. And I basically describe things to the robot, and then the robot gives me images back. And that's our conversation. I send it words, it sends me back pictures.
Okay. Midjourney diye bir program kullanıyor kendisi. Aslında bu konularda benim bahsettiğim sitelerde çözümler getiriyorlar. Özellikle de günümüzde hem Netflix olsun hem Spotify olsun art ya da sanat portalleri veya özellikle Vermilion'un bahsettiği moda fotoğrafçılığı ya da moda alanında çok ünlü firmaların kullandıkları metotlar var. Bunlar yenilikçi metotlar. Bu konuda birisinden bahsedeceğim. I would like to ask you what you think of Bernadette Drill. She's a Paris-based art director, and she took courses in MIT to create fashion, what you do actually, artificial intelligence-based fashion design, and also everything related to new experience, how viewers would be part of it, how viewers would manipulate the space, as you have done. So do you know about her?
I believe so, yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that these tools are sort of breaking down some of those barriers between different disciplines. So if you think about architecture, it's a profession with standards and testing and licenses and things like that. If you think about fashion, it's one that is a very, it's a community, right? You think about all of these sort of various design disciplines. And it's kind of interesting that these tools allow, let's say, a fashion designer to also think about the space that, let's say, the fashion would be seen in, or posed within, or is informed by, right, and vice versa. So I think what could be really interesting about this is just how it breaks down some of the disciplinary barriers, the sort of walls between different disciplines. You could start to have, I think, much more fun collaborating and drawing on different disciplines to sort of think about, I find it really refreshing to see folks from fashion thinking about architecture they think about it in a different way than I do. And I find that fascinating. And I think AI is one of those tools that is actually enabling this sort of new way of thinking about these things. In the United States, we call these sort of like, you put things in little silos, right? We put things in boxes. And what I think is happening is we're starting to flatten some of these things out so that we can have some, I think, really productive, or at least starting to be interesting cross-disciplinary dialogues based around our common language, which is a visual language, right? The language of design is different than, let's say, well, I would say this, it's something that we all have in common to a certain degree, right? And so I think that's another way of sort of reconnecting our world, right? In ways that I don't think was possible, certainly when we were at drafting tables and or you know, constrained by just physical prototyping these things. And then two, I would say, you know, I think it's also interesting that these things are proliferating or spreading so quickly on social media. You know, you know, social media is that sort of other catalyst for everybody being aware of these new tools very quickly. And I think, you know, I think that's helping sort of create, again, building bridges between different disciplines, between different folks, geographically as well as between different disciplines. So, but I see these ideas. It's like, you know, the idea of the meme as one that's just ideas that spread quickly, not necessarily just the funny things that we share on social media, but the things that the ideas that spread quickly is just so quick now that it sort of breaks down that geometry, that sort of geography, physical geography. And so, you know, I would say that there's definitely something to study here with the sort of geography of AI. The geography of AI is much different than, let's say, a globe. But I think it's quite an interesting question, because I think it also gets to the idea that could anybody do it, right? If they're just really good at writing down prompts. And I would argue yes and no, right? I would say there's generation, but then there's also at the end curation, right? Knowing what's possible or what's good, having the critical eye, having your eye on the sort of taste and directions of the time is something else. So I don't think it's you can't just take the results uncritically with any tool, right? And especially with artificial intelligence. So that was a sort of a wondering response, but I hope I addressed your question. I think it was a good one. Again, I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And that's how actually artificial intelligence brought your artworks to my attention. That's how I found you and invited you.
Yeah,
That's
Instagram,
amazing,
right?
don't you think?
Yeah.
Yes.
Or LinkedIn, one or the
So,
other, yeah.
we owe a lot actually to artificial. They're very fashionable. I mean, changing the space into a nature environment. I mean, an architectural space can be converted into a nature space. So what do you think of that? Actually, you have actually some practices on that, I think, through your artwork. I have seen very few.
Right,
examples.
yeah, exactly. So there's also ways to blend things, right? You can actually, you could take traditional sort of design process, sketches, drawings. We'd like to make models and things like that and then photograph them. So there's lots of different ways you could begin to input information into these models. And then again, telling it what to do, how to reinterpret them, right? So yeah, I would say, you know, to me, the question is always going to be how much control does someone want or not want, right? My approach with these tools right now that we have I embrace the fact that we don't have a lot of control. But it's not hard to imagine in the future, each of us having our own models that learn about us and then become really good personal assistants. And my model would be a good personal assistant for me, but would probably be a really bad personal assistant for you if it could actually learn quickly, right? All of those nuances, right? So to me, it's sort of, you know, the question now is how much control do we want, and how much do we want to give control to AI? Right now, it's just generating images or, you know, whatever we ask it to do. And I think, you know, one of the questions is, you know, ethical questions is well, what do we want it to control for us, right? I know a lot of creative people that would love to have AI do all of the sort of managerial stuff, the thing that responds to their emails and make sure that the spreadsheet budgets are working, so that they can, they fall into that trap of the more successful they are as a creative, the less time they actually have to do creative things. And so, you know, whereas I'm trying to think about how AI can help us be creative, or help augment our creative, or how AI could actually be creative. Others might think of AI as something that can do the mundane tasks for us and automate that stuff to allow us, the humans, to be more creative, right? But certainly, to get back to your question, I mean, I'm doing a lot of tests where I'm thinking about, well, how can this either get my creativity going, get me unstuck when I'm sort of stuck, you know, staring at something and not really doing something. And in this case, I find it to be a very apt tool, because I can do something. I can write something completely outlandish. I could give it, you know, pump in an image of a building and say, please turn this into an aquarium full of fish and scuba divers, and, you know, I can give it weird things, right? I can tell it to change the context, or I can tell it to change the lighting, and you know, those sorts of things are very helpful. To sort of, again, to sort of test the idea without spending minutes rather than days testing the idea, right? So I think that's an interesting value proposition, is how speedy, how fast this tool is in generating these images, remarkably fast.
Yapay zekanın aslında bazı şeyleri değiştirme gücünün hızlı olduğunu biliyoruz, ama öncelikle yapay zekanın hayatımızı ne kadar kontrol etmesini istiyoruz. Bazı iş insanları kendi hayatlarını daha düzene sokmak için yapay zekadan yarar sağlamayı düşünebilirler. Ama burada aslında hem etik olarak hem de insanın üretme gücüyle orantılı olan ve insanın değiştirme gücüyle paralel olan yapay zekayı ne kadar kullanmak istediği. Bunu tartıştık, çünkü ben kendisine özellikle mimari mekan oluşturma, yapay bir mimari mekan oluşturma ile ilgili bir soru sormuştum. Çünkü Çağdaş Müzecilik'te bu çok önde giden bir kavram. Artık Çağdaş Müze'de, postmodern müzede hiçbir şey olmadan kişi bir mekana girip o mekanda katılımcı olarak kendisi nesne olarak mekanı yönetebiliyor. O nedenle ve yapay zeka becerisiyle bunu insanlar ne kadar kullanacaklar ve insan kontrolünde devam edecek mi bu süreç? Bunları konuştuk. Başka sorusu olan var mıdır?
Hocam benim yapay zeka ve etikle alakalı bir sorum vardı. İzin verirseniz sormak istiyorum.
Buyurun. Buyurun.
So there are many concerns from artists and illustrator communities around the world about the ethics of AI-generated art, since most image generators have been using Illustrator's art to train the AI without artist permission. Like a few months ago, someone on my Journey Discord asked about prompt recommendations on how to copy a not very popular illustrator's art style instead of just commissioning them. Like, So this situation causes a backlash for AI art, as the software is being used to duplicate and mimic art and art styles of illustrators without giving them proper credits, causing AI art to be seen as art theft, rightfully so, I think. My question is, with AI art being in a state called weak AI, meaning like mimicking things humans can do, like a calculator, so do you think AI art softwares can be developed to have some sense of authenticity that it won't be considered art theft? As far as I know, most artists don't give permission for their art being used to train AI. This has got me thinking, and I'd like to hear your comments on this, please.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I approach this question not as an artist, but as somebody who obviously has a lot of design work out there that's also been used in the training for these language models, as well as writing for language models for, let's say, ChatGPT. You know, what I find interesting is how we get past this idea that, well, let me back up for just a moment, right? I'm not sure that every single artist is upset about this. Who's upset about this is upset just because their work was, you know, their work that was online was, you know, online and was then deconstructed in a static, and then the algorithm learned from that, and it's machine learning. I think there's a larger fear, and I think the larger fear that I see is that a community like, let's say, artists that are, except for a very, very select few, often not well paid, often not well compensated for their talents, now see this as yet another sort of slight to their, or I guess, threat to them being able to make a living. And so, you know, a lot of the arguments I see are sort of misinformation about how the systems actually work. Because I think even if you dispelled those misinformation about how the models work and how they're trained, there's still that fear. There's still that fear of, is this going to augment what we do or replace what we do? And again, I think it's up to artists and other creatives to interrogate these tools and to think about them, right? So artists, when photography was being developed, were very fearful of photography. They thought it was going to destroy drawing and painting. And eventually it didn't, right? Photography situated itself as its own sort of discipline within the fine arts, with its own body of knowledge and its own theory. And I think that's up for us. I don't see this replacing photography, at least not good photography. I don't see this replacing painting, at least not good painting. There's no shortage of artificial intelligence generated visuals, right? There's no scarcity. And so perhaps in a place where these tools are now ubiquitous, things with the human touch become more valuable. At least that's my hope. And maybe I'm being over optimistic or naive, but I think that the genie is out of the bottle. There's no going back. And so if artists want to bury their heads in the sand and say it's not happening or complain about it, it's not fruitful. I think what would be most fruitful is for them to sort of begin to interrogate these as a sort of creative medium and to really understand better what it can and can't do. How it can be locally trained. You can train it on just your own data if you like. In order to, again, push it, right? Art, in my opinion, is always asking questions about humans and what direction we're headed, and is that direction really progress or not? And I think we need artists more than ever to look at this stuff, and instead of just sort of dismissing it, to really explore it. Otherwise, we cede that territory to just the technologists, and we can't do that, right? There's an ethical imperative that artists, more artists, sort of see this as an opportunity, another medium to be creative with. And I think there are some that do. There are a lot of artists I respect and I'm really proud of that they follow me, and I follow them back, and I don't do what they do. But on the other hand, you know, I get a lot of comments that say things that are pretty mean. And, you know, as a design technologist, I can't not experiment with these new design technologies. It would be professional malpractice to not sort of try to better understand what can they do, what can they not do at this point, where is it going, and how is it going to affect the students that I'm educating? It's going to affect them, but we're still trying to understand just how. And so I get a lot of heat from, you know, scared artists, or at least some folks consider themselves artists. I don't know, you know, but and it's like, hey, you know, like, you know, hate me all you want, I don't care, you know, but I'm just doing my job. And if I wasn't looking at this, then I would definitely be doing my discipline, my profession, and my students that I'm training for that discipline a disservice. Because we have to look at these things. We can't dismiss them. And so a lot of the arguments I see around, well, should my work be part of this training regimen, this huge, massive, you know, accumulation of training material, should it be a part of that or not? I mean, anybody who's had work in a history book or on the internet or on Pinterest, you know, has been, you know, training future artists or future designers, right? And, you know, at some point, I think you have to ask yourself, how many original ideas are still out there, right? I mean, we can combine things in novel ways, and, you know, but at this point, you know, I would not use the word steal or theft, because I think fundamentally that's not what is happening. And so I would be critical back at folks who make that argument and say, look, you can't ignore it. The question is, how do you work with it, right? The question is, how do we, what, it's not realistic to raise red flags about the whole thing. What do we really be critical of? How do we shape this, right? Artists should be at that table to make some of these decisions. They're thinking about things that a computer programmer doesn't. They're thinking about things that a venture capitalist doesn't. They're thinking about things that a CEO doesn't. And that voice is important. They need to be heard. But it's not productive, I think, to just sort of dismiss it out of hand. They need to be at the table. They need to be looking at this stuff. And so that's the attitude I approach with this. I don't know if I think that this is, you know, I'm just going to be creating images from diffusion models the rest of my life, you know, but right now that's where it's at, and that's what I'm interrogating, and it's going to change. It's going to evolve. It's actually changing quite quickly. You know, what's interesting is that it does rely on a lot of training data, but what's also interesting is how these language models are proven to be quite robust and how they can learn. You just can keep feeding more data into them, and they just keep getting better and better at doing other things, right? So, yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know what the answer to that really is, but I'm not sure that it's productive just to accuse the software or whoever is using it as being evil, which I see a lot of. I'm not saying that you're saying that, but I see a lot of this, right? You brought this up, that we see this a lot, especially on social media. It seems like it brings out some critics. It's not helpful. Ignoring it or just saying I'm not going to take part in it is not going to make the artist any money either. Right?
Yeah, I agree.
I think the question
get
is
your
how
point.
do we begin to change these models so that the creative class that can actually, you know, be compensated in some way, right? Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic question. I don't know, but again, what we can't do is shut down and just say we're going to ignore it, right?
Yeah, I think
if
so.
we do that, we don't have a seat at the table for how to shape it. And I think that's really important. That's my only point. I don't know, did that help? Was that helpful in sort of what I
Yeah,
did?
actually, it did help.
Yeah.
When I asked this question to like other AI generator users, like some of them just dismissed the question, like saying, who doesn't steal like that? But your perspective really helps. Like artists need to be at those tables too, I think.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
can dismiss the AI. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, to me, what's interesting is that a lot of the folks that I see using Midjourney are creatives. I mean, there are people that it's not like they just they didn't do anything creative before and now suddenly they're creative people. But they were artists, or they are artists. They do make things, they do paint things or draw things or sketch things or design things or prototype things, or in a lot of different scales. I did a workshop a while back and there was only 50 seats. There was 50 amazing individuals from all over the globe, all different time zones, and from a number of different disciplines. We had fashion, we had product design, industrial design, experience design, architecture, landscape, urbanists. We had all sorts of people really interested in sort of trying to better understand, well, what can we do with this, right? And I think that's the right spirit. To me, I mean, that's the Zeitgeist, right? The train's leaving the station. If you're not on it, you're going to be replaced by somebody using AI. You might not be replaced by AI, but I think the irony is that you might be replaced by somebody who's augmented by AI, right? So is it a prosthesis of the brain? Is it you know, are we now cybernetic individuals anyway? I mean, we carry around smartphones and wearables and things like that sense and augment us anyway. You know, so I think the question is, well, how can these help us do the things that we actually want to do? And I'd extend that to not just people who are trying to make money, but folks who are trying to make art. I think that's important. I don't have any good answers, but I think I think it would be I think artists need to be at the table to help us find those answers. Yeah, I think it would be bad or perhaps maybe not productive to think that we could do this without artists.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So if there are no other questions, we are coming to the end. Any more questions? Okay. So it was a great lecture and also a chat between visitors. I thank you very much for my behalf, all my students and also visitors. It was great talking with you, Joshua, and I wish you good luck in your new Harper's Bazaar adventure in Europe.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for spending part of your Friday with me. I appreciate the questions and the conversation. It's very nice way to start my day. My day started a couple of hours ago, so it's still morning time here. So
And it's
the rest of my Friday.
anchor now. Yes.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Have a
Thank you
great
again.
weekend.
It was my
Bye-bye.
pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.
Herkese iyi akşamlar. Konferansın sonuna geldik. Herkese çok iyi bir hafta sonu diliyorum. Yapay zekayı çok kullanan bireyler olarak hepinize hoşça kalın.